perhaps people who are going out of their way to eat a plant-based diet, which is what I do, and it's a decision you make, right? You go to a restaurant and you have to be like, oh crap, okay, what am I eating? May have different life priorities than people who just eat a normal diet, or that diet's not even a part of their concern.
Bringing you a reasoned approach to health and fitness. This is the Phi Life Podcast.
Welcome to the Phi Life Podcast. I'm John Barbin. With me is Brad Pilon. And today I want to talk about this ongoing controversy I'm seeing online between various diet influencers. Talking about this study that came out comparing vegetarian or plant-based protein sources versus animal-based proteins for health and longevity. And it's a 30-year follow-up on the nurses' health study. It's like a big one with tens of thousands of nurses. And I don't know if people know this, but a lot of the data we're getting only come from 2 or 3 studies. This is one of the big ones.
The study, and they're just following people throughout their life.
The Framingham study. And we're still referencing these studies for almost everything. So now these are observational. Obviously, you can't take 50,000 people and tell them what to do. And all they're doing is asking them to report in on what they've been eating.
You basically call them every once in a while and be like, hey, what did you eat the last 3 days and how you feeling? And then every once in a while they go in for some lab markers, right?
And this started back in the 80s, and they're comparing 1984 to now. And they're doing some diet recall records, which we already know are flawed. And
so that's when I would call you and I would ask you to recount what you ate in the last couple of days. And then I would prompt you. So you're like, I had a blueberry muffin, and I would say, okay, well, was it a big one? Was it a small one? The size of a tennis ball, the size of a racquetball? How many blueberries on it? Where'd you buy it? Approximately how much did it weigh? I try to get as much info as we can. But the problem is, we've done videos of this before, right? Depending on what I might think is a large muffin compared to what the average person might think is a large muffin. Like it's in large groups, it kind of normalizes into some general trends. But in terms of really digging into what someone actually ate, it's pretty limited because I barely remember what I ate yesterday or this morning. So it has its flaws for sure.
Right. And and for their food frequency questionnaire, like how often do you eat certain foods, in their discussion, they said one of the strengths of their study was validated because they compared it to the diet recall records. But diet recall records aren't accurate. So the tool...
it was really accurate for me when I'm asked what foods I ate. The ones that come off the top of my head are also, when I do a frequency questionnaire, are the ones I think I eat the most of. So they're always going to line up because they're the top. I'm going to say bananas, right? It's your biases twice.
Right. So they cite the accuracy of one test because it's valid and it was consistent with a different test, but that different test is inaccurate.
Yeah.
So, and we know
measuring the same thing. Yeah.
Right. Well, we know diet recall records just aren't that good, and people easily forget. Even in 24 hours, they're just not very good at reporting what they actually eat. Also, there's a shame thing. People just won't talk about what they actually eat. They hide it. So diet recall records are kind of useless. No one's going to tell the truth on those things. But anyways, they're trying to make this sweeping statement that, plant-based proteins have been proven to be better for longevity because less people, there's more people that died in the animal-based protein category. But again, they're following up on 2-year intervals and then asking them what did they eat throughout the year?
The other thing is you can regress. I don't know how to, we need to be able to explain what it means to regress something, but you account for other trends or lifestyle things that might be going on. But in general, in the United States, you would say that perhaps people who are going out of their way to eat a plant-based diet, which is what I do, and it's a decision you make, right? You go to a restaurant and you have to be like, oh crap, okay, what am I eating? May have different life priorities than people who just eat a normal diet, or that diet's not even a part of their concern, right? So you and I used the example a long time ago that if you were to test people by calling them and ask them, how many pairs of running shoes do you own? How often do you replace them? How new are they? How well do you take care of them? You could probably show that owning running shoes causes or is related to people who run more and thus are healthier, right? Like
Mhm.
it depends on how you do it. So the plant-based people, especially, and you got to remember this, this isn't 2021 internet access. This is 1984, pre-internet, pre your phones, pre-Twitter, pre-Instagram. Like if you're plant-based in the early 1990s, like you're making a considerable effort. You're outside the realm of normal. You are not going to a restaurant that has you know, the risotto as your obvious vegan option at every bloody restaurant. That like there's no option. You're asking
Mm.
for a specific food. So you are teasing out people who are making, I'm going to say, purposeful life sacrifices almost in order to adhere to a diet that at the late 80s, early 90s would have been very difficult to adhere to relative to now.
Right, right. So, yeah, to Brad's point, it could just be self-selecting for somebody who's just paying attention to their
Yeah.
health in general.
Yeah.
And so I see people arguing over this, and I'm thinking, whoever is passionately arguing about this, what are you going to do? Switch to plant-based for the next 30 years and just see if it worked? Like, are you really going to do that? Like, probably not.
Yeah.
Are you maybe go half and half? Like, are you a perimenopausal woman? Like, that's all that was being tested here.
Working night shifts in a traditionally very stressful job. Like there's so much going on with a nurse's study because it's nurses, right? Like it's a
Mm-hmm.
phenomenal population. It doesn't really represent the rest of North America.
Yeah, it's very specific. How
Yeah.
many of them are night shift nurses? How many of them are day shift? Again, the age that they're at, they're all going through perimenopause and then on into menopause during this study, which is not representative for any male.
Yeah.
So you could try to infer that it's whatever their result is based on these just diet recall measurements. Okay, so definitively plant-based is better. Even if that was true, we can only say it for women, not men.
And better for what, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't even get into the statistics. I'd actually need someone to help me tease out the statistics on how many more or less people did actually have a cardiac event, or how many more died in the
Oh, was
animal-based
it
group than the
all odds
plant-based group.
ratios? Probably was, right?
It's beyond what I could even really analyze. Because that's all it is. Because
Yeah.
the method is just asking people stuff, and then they have to tease all kinds of information out of that. So it's not like it's highly controlled.
So the main problem I have is when it comes to diets, when you pick one that you really like, you're the one you're attached to at this moment, that's the right diet for everything. And the issue is that a diet that is healthy might not necessarily be a diet that helps you build muscle. And is actually, if you think about it, certainly not a diet that makes you lose weight, right? Like for optimal health, you wouldn't be on a diet that's just continually making you lose weight until you die, right? So
Mhm.
a truly healthful diet probably keeps you relatively weight stable, may or may not cause muscle gain. Along the same lines, a diet that causes large amounts of muscle gain may not be classically considered a healthy diet, let alone a one that causes fat loss. And a fat loss diet might not do either. So, but you get caught up on, but I'm interested in muscle. So this diet caused increase in muscle mass, and muscle mass is good. Therefore, if the plant-based one doesn't cause muscle mass, it can't be good. Right. So it's that all encompassing nature of I like a diet, therefore it's good, everything, as
Mhm.
opposed to the diet that keeps you healthiest may not be the diet that helps you maintain the most lean muscle mass, even though maintaining lean muscle mass is generally considered healthy as you age. Like
Mhm.
they're still independent variables. So that's a lot of where the online, instead of listening to each other, just screaming back and forth in Twitter comes from, right? Is you're actually completely arguing two different points, right? John's arguing Star Trek, I'm arguing Star Wars, and we don't even realize we're talking about different shows. That's pretty much what they're usually doing.
Right. So if that data has any validity to it, you can only say it's in women of that age.
For this
And
specific thing they measured. Yeah.
you might even go as far as to say it's only in women that age who are employed as nurses because it's kind of a specific life.
Yeah.
So,
It's a
and
high stress job.
I live with a nurse. I know exactly. It's a different kind of life. It is just a different kind of life, like compared to everybody else. And you can, and base in talking and asking people once every 2 years how it went. There's so much variability built into that. You don't actually really know what's going on throughout those years. Their diets could phase in and out too. They could be going for stretches of time where they aren't really on the diet they said they kind of were on. So it's just, it's hard to know what to take from this, if anything, for anybody else. And to Brad's point, if whatever diet you're on, if you're happy with your results, just do that. And there's no reason to really change your life over this, or make major changes or get stressed about what you're doing just because a claim of a definitive 30 years later, less people died on the one diet. Like, is that really something you're going to change your life over?
Right? Like it reminds me of that earlier 2024, like earlier this year, late last year, that study out of Wuhan, China came out about intermittent fasting and cardiovascular disease. But they were looking back in like the 80s kind of thing, and like no one was doing intermittent fasting in the 1980s. Like it wasn't a thing. So people who were missing meals back then were missing meals, right? It wasn't a trendy thing to do. It wasn't, I don't even think the search term intermittent fasting showed up. So the chronology of where you're pulling your data from really does matter. So like I like to point out that these nurses, again, living in the 80s and 90s in a high stress job that may be doing shift work, still taking the time to make sure they're eating a higher plant-based diet, are a different type of person than the person who's not doing that. And that right alone, I mean, you almost have to say whatever results you got from that study were specific to those decades.
That's nurses in the 80s and in the 90s.
Yeah.
And would that translate to now? We don't know.
No, because like right now, for instance, I could get in my car, I could drive 10 minutes away, and there's a store that sells vegan Kit Kats. I could have like 2 or 3 Kit Kat bars that I want, and they would have been vegan, right? And then I can have a Beyond Burger, and I can have 2 or 3 of those, get 60 grams of plant-based protein in. Like those were not options. You were eating lentil burgers, and they were gross, right? I don't even know if like Lick's Home Burger exists in the States, but it was like one of the first places to have a nature burger. And that was, gosh, in Canada, like the early 2000s, late 1990s, like 80s. It's so you generally look at these studies, you really have to pay attention to the date it was published, and then realize the data was from a couple of years before that, and think of what life was like in those times, right? So you look at data from the 1990s, and you would say that phone use has absolutely no effect on a kid's schooling or attention, like all that stuff, because a phone was a completely different thing. It wasn't a handheld. It was literally a thing on the wall you use, right? So you really have to be careful on the chronology, and then taking that information and applying it to now.
Right. And the other lesson here is large scale population based information isn't, again, it's not meant to recommend for one person.
No.
But that's where these arguments end up with these people online, kind of maybe not 100% saying you must do this, but by the end of their talk, it sounds kind of convincing that you should do it because they just talk about all the benefits. But is that really meant for you? Just because this paper suggests out of these 50,000 people we've talked to over time, it seems as though it works out this way. It doesn't mean it's going to work out in your exact life. And again, to Brad's point, is it consistent with your goals anyways? I mean, obviously no one wants to die early, so everyone would like to have less chance of dying. But that's the other thing. We're talking about risk of something happening. We're not necessarily talking about something actually happening to any one individual.
Yep.
So it's the difference between looking at a study where you ingest something and you can actually show a blood level of something changing, and that kind of does that to everybody. Now, again, that's a surrogate endpoint that may or may not have anything to do with your life further down the road. But at least you can say, oh, that's interesting. Like in my case, I took niacin, my liver enzymes went up.
Right.
Not everyone's going to, it's not a survey study. It's like, that's just what happened. And in many people that can happen. So that's something to maybe be aware of. And maybe if you're ever going to take niacin, just incorporate that information into your decision tree, I guess.
Yeah.
But when you see studies on tens of thousands of people 30 years down the road, something trended one way or another, that's really hard to take any of that and add it to your life.
Yeah.
Because it's what.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was also thinking it's the individual out. I'm not even going to try to. I'm going to butcher that word 8 times out of 10. But if you, let's say, you're emaciated and you are 7 years old, then adding muscle, preserving muscle mass would probably be of paramount importance to you because it would be a risk factor for mortality. But if you're not, but let's say you have high markers of cardiovascular disease, that would be whatever eating style you choose would probably be directed by that, right? So I don't think, to your point, a giant population just norms out everything, and there's no risk factors for anyone that are unique because you're looking at 50,000 people. So you can't make an individual decision based on that information. I mean, it's still good research to have, don't get me wrong, but in terms of using that to then sort of prescribe something to yourself, it's not the best choice.
Yeah, not at all. So if you've seen this debate going on and you've felt convinced that plant-based protein's better for you, you can test it. I don't know how you can test your longevity because you'll have to check in 30 years later to see if it did anything, or however old you are. You'd need to be, if this is true, you'd need to be consistent on it, which, but no one's going to do that. So it's probably not terrible to mix up your protein sources. There's no reason not to do that, but I wouldn't look at the DIS data as definitive reason to eliminate animal-based proteins. Because the other thing this particular study doesn't consider is any other population who has had longevity, preserved longevity with an omnivorous diet with more animal-based proteins. It doesn't prove that in any other population that's a bad way to eat. It's just
I never thought of that.
Well, the way they collected this data,
yeah,
just for these nurses, and to Brad's point, going from the 80s and all the confounding idea that that's not a mainstream thing to go vegetarian or vegan in the 80s. So it probably just self-selected for people who are really paying attention to their health.
Yeah.
Well, what does any of that have to do with a bunch of guys who are ex-athletes or
in 2024?
Just different categories of people who aren't nurses from the 80s.
Yeah.
So it really isn't that transferable.
They don't normalize. So it's not like you're looking at, okay, so I've looked at that Blue Zones book, and I know that the average life expectancy in the Mediterranean is 82, but I know that in Japan it's 83, but Barbados is 90. So I'm looking at all the Blue Zones, and then look at these nurses, and holy crap, they made it to 96, right? So it's not actually being compared. The longevity is not being compared as a finite calculable number that you can compare amongst groups. They just lasted slightly longer than the other group or had less deaths in the group, right? But you're not comparing across other cohorts to be like, actually, when you compare them all, these nurses didn't live any longer than this meat eating group over here.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, it's so less, that would in this exact group, it basically shows less
deaths,
less premature deaths,
yeah.
Which I'm still skeptical how you arrive at that just based. Like, I don't even know.
It's also not longevity either, right? Like,
not really.
Yeah.
Well, I think we think of longevity the wrong way around. We think about it as actually extending life. You can't really extend the human life much longer than somewhere between 90s and 100 tops. What I think you can do is eliminate early death, or not eliminate, try to reduce the chance of an early death.
So then via the population, you're increasing life expectancy, but for any individual, you're not, right? Like the life expectancy. So by getting rid of the people who die early, by lessening the amount of people who die early, you're boosting up that number of the average life expectancy from 80 to 82. But for any individual in that group, you didn't actually add 2 years to their lives.
Not really,
right?
No.
Yeah.
It's almost like
playing with numbers.
It's kind of like we seem to be built to make it to something between 90 and 100 if nothing goes wrong. Like absolutely nothing. You never get cancer. You never have cardiovascular disease. Just none of that stuff happens, or any other fatal disease. None of that happens, and you just sort of die of old age, and that's going to happen somewhere between 90 and 100 if you can last that long. But it's not like any of these interventions make you live to 140. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's when we study any of this and they talk about this, anything to do with longevity, it's about reducing the rate of early death where people die in their 60s and 70s and don't even get 80 plus. Yeah. So I remember one of our physician friends kind of viewed dying in your 60s as young. And if you can somehow make it to 80-ish, you have a good chance of lasting another 10, 15 years past 80. And it was kind of saying the window is, can you go from 60 to 75? Like the 60s to 70s is where a lot of people drop off from just many different things going wrong. Yeah. But if you get through those 2 decades, your 60s and your 70s, he's like, there's a good chance you're just going to keep going to, 80, 90 plus. Like you're going to make it because you've sort of survived the 60s and 70s where all of these, the rates of cancer go up, the cardiovascular disease, like something really bad, strokes, all those sort of things. If none of it happens in the 60s and 70s, it's like you're just going to go right through the 80s too.
You're good stock. You're good.
Yeah, you're good stock. That's a really good way of saying it.
I had a conversation actually with another person. We were talking about life expectancies in different countries. And I was pointing out how I think the life expectancy in Canada is like roughly around 80. And he was like, yeah, but you realize that means that 50% of the population doesn't make it to 80. Like for some reason, we view that life expectancy per country number as like, that's my guaranteed number. Like I'm going to make it to 80 because I live in Canada. And he's like, well, no, half of you don't. Right. Yeah. So it's it's interesting playing with numbers. I find it sort of that like, it kind of reminds me of students playing around with Excel spreadsheets, trying to get the results they wanted from their study, that kind of early. It feels a lot like that. We start talking longevity. You start talking, you're teasing numbers and you're removing people. And by getting rid of people who died very young, you're really boosting up that number without actually changing the life expectancy of anybody else. Like unless you're looking at true markers, I don't understand what we're doing with a lot of this longevity stuff, right? And then the idea that longevity is just diet and exercise is such a complete fallacy, right? When anybody who actually studies this all the way back to when we met Aubrey de Grey is like, no, that's a small part of it, but that's not it, right? Mm-hmm. So we're spending a lot of time arguing over, realistically, from what I understand, whether or not you're eating a real burger or a Beyond Meat burger probably matters less than who you're eating with it, what your mood is like, and what house you're eating it in, right? Like all these things come into play. So, yeah, I think it's just something to argue over the internet about.
And did you walk there and walk home?
Exactly. What'd you do before? What'd you do after?
Yeah. I maintain that the more you stress about diet and exercise specifics for longevity, you're just taking steps backwards with the added stress. Like the more obsessive compulsive you get about this, the worse off you're actually going to be. Yeah. So I guess that's kind of the take home message about things where a study comes out that makes kind of a sensational, or people are making sensational claims that, oh, now we know, like just plant-based is better. And that's the key to living longer. There's, until you test all the different ways to eat and all the different populations of people and across all, just everywhere, it's not going to be anything worth you incorporating into your routine.
There's so much at play, right? So even if we just do nutrition, so I'm plant-based, John's not, but I drink and John doesn't. So right there, which one's more important, right? Like there's so many other factors to what you were just saying. It's almost not worth stressing over. You just pick the one that fits you and go.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of that's the final point. There's other factors that aren't accounted for. And are you going to change all of those factors? Like it goes from a population based headline down to, are you going to do anything individually with that? And in most cases, it's not really worth incorporating into your routine unless you can definitively prove what's going to happen this week something's got to change. You can't do it now to think what something's going to happen in 30 years. No one's actually going to, no one's, there's no motivation, and it's hard to stay motivated doing something now, but you can't measure it. You just switch it now and just hope something's going to happen 30 years from now. That's, we just know we're not going to do that. And it's just, it's not a viable way to structure your diet and fitness, I don't know, plan.
Yeah. Especially if in 20 years from now, we've completely cured cancer. Like, and then it's so it's so far in the future, and we're improving what we're doing so much that there's no way when they started the nurses study in 1980, they're like, hey, how are we going to account for the iPhones that come out in the 2000s, right? Like,
right.
Yeah. So anyway, we're just going on around in circles now, but
we're going a little bit of a circle here. So I think we got the point across. Don't overthink it when studies like this come out. It might not really be worth your effort.
Done. Yeah.
Right. All right. So for Brad Pilon, I'm John Barbin, and that's your Fi Life Podcast.